one example I would give is the current terrible divide that we have around both economic justice issues and racial justice issues as seen in our national politics. I think that, that is partly because of the abandonment of the idea that political organizing should occur across identity groups.
Hi, it's great to see you. And this is my research assistant, Andi Pla.
Hi.
Hi, Andy.
So we're excited to talk with you about your book, Susan. When we think about civil rights in the employment context, I think, often the story that we talk about starts in 1964 when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. Why did you choose to study civil rights in the late 1800s and early 1900s?
Well, it was kind of an accident. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, as it was called, and it's still called, was founded in 1910. And in doing that project, I started to see the huge wealth of prior attempts at racial justice organizing prior to 1910.
What actually was the law as it related to the workplace in the late 1800s and 1900s?
There were almost no provisions that barred discrimination in any way, including in employment. There were lots of state and local laws, and for a time in the federal government as well, that explicitly mandated discrimination, that explicitly required that certain job categories were only open to people of the privileged race or white people. And then another big issue that I think we have to confront is the fact that labor unions were also extraordinarily, most of them, exclusionary, and they enforce that exclusion both through their rules of membership, but also through violence and other means. One of the big problems after Reconstruction was here were all kinds of freed persons who needed to find their way economically and to move into more economic security. And the means that everybody else had to do that, which was to get better jobs, was completely closed out to African Americans. And other people of color as well. And so that history continued. Really, it wasn't completely removed until 1964 with the passage of Title VII of Civil Rights Act.
It's interesting that you bring up the unions piece, because that was a part of your book that I actually learned a lot. And one of the people that you profiled was Thomas Fortune, who's a lot of his ideas framed the NAACP, right? But I did notice there was a conflict between leadership about whether to stand with the labor movement or not. So could you kind of expand on that divide and what became of it?
So there was a big conflict because many leaders with very different political commitments were involved in these debates that were occurring in what I call the nadir period, which was a period in which really nothing positive was happening. So some of the activists, such as T. Thomas Fortune, at least when he was a younger man, who were very committed to various kinds of sort of English democratic socialism, were deeply invested in the idea of coalition politics and the idea that people who had less privilege in life should band together across differences and work for more economic justice. So that was sort of one set of people. But then there was another set of people. And at this point, I would say that Booker T. Washington was sort of the figurehead or the leader of this group that was very hostile to labor unions, did not believe the white working class would ever see that their interests were furthered by working with persons of color, and believe that the correct strategy was to form an alliance with sort of the leadership, the capitalists, the people who had money and influence and power. And I think you still see those tensions in racial justice activism today.
How so?
I think that many people who are leaders in the African American community are much more focused on alliances with corporations and employers. And I'm not knocking that at all, because that has helped many people. And then there are still people who have a more of a grassroots and a kind of organizing persons with less privilege and power to demand rights. That's a very different approach. And so we see both of those strands to racial justice organizing today. And one example I would give is the current terrible divide that we have around both economic justice issues and racial justice issues, as seen in our national politics. I think that that is partly because of the abandonment of the idea that political organizing should occur across identity groups. And I certainly have plenty of friends who are very active in racial justice organizing, who are just fed up with the white working class and want to have nothing to do with them, and think that that class is inherently racist. And I certainly understand why, given what's happening in our national politics today. But that's the kind of thing that somebody like T. Thomas Fortune would roll over in his grave if he got a glimpse of where we are today.
So in your book, you profile a lot of leaders, right? Maybe some who failed in the beginning and learned from those failures. But which one is just personally your favorite?
I guess I would have to say that for some reason T. Thomas Fortune was, as you could tell, because he was so, he was really a genius.
That was, I think, my favorite person to read about also.
And, he had struggles, he had mental health struggles for sure. And then he sort of ended up in this sort of, to my mind, a tragic place later.
For those folks who haven't read the book, can you tell us a little bit the story of T. Thomas Fortune?
T. Thomas Fortune was born enslaved. He was fairly young when emancipation occurred. So he really saw the harsh end of Reconstruction, because he was in Florida, and he moved to New York City. He took over a small newspaper, and that newspaper eventually became the New York Age, which was the best African American newspaper of the era. And he really used that newspaper to engage in all kinds of sort of inquiry about politics and about organizing for racial justice. He wrote a number of books. He was extremely conversant in political theory. He went to Howard University, and he also went through 2 years of law school at Howard University Law School. He wrote wonderful analyses that I think sort of are precursors to critical race studies today, talking about the Supreme Court opinions and really critiquing them at this deep and important level. And he was very active in two forerunner organizations, the Afro-American League, which kind of collapsed after a while, and then the Afro-American Council. And those organizations eventually were part of the stream that flowed into founding the NAACP.
So on the topic of employment, you bring up that one of the pressing issues of the time was this exclusion in employment, or inferiority in employment.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you think that that's an issue that has carried on to today? And, if so, what that looks like?
Yes, I absolutely do think that there are huge continuing problems with employment discrimination today. And that's another strand of my scholarship, and I've written about that in a variety of approaches. I think what that discrimination looks like is totally different today than what it looked like in the late 19th century. But I do think the legacy of what happened during the 19th century very much is sort of baked into many, many institutions in both private and public sector employment. And I like to call that structural discrimination, and that there's lots of structural discrimination that continues to this day.